Hey folks, this is Eric coming to you live from the recent past on the mean streets of Brooklyn, New York with a quick programming note before we start. We recorded this episode pretty early on in our process as we were creating this podcast, and as such, the audio mix is not quite what we were hoping for. In fact, it's pretty bad in some spots. So I just wanted to put that out there. We did think this conversation was smart and funny, and this is an important film, so we wanted to share this with you, and we hope you enjoy it.
This is your profanity warning. Your warning that bad words are about to be said in the following podcast. If there are children in the room, in the house, or indeed within a 5-mile radius, please send them away. This podcast is not for us. Is that good?
Yeah, it was great. That was perfect.
Okay.
I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy.
Coming to you live from the recent past in filthy New York City. Welcome to 21 Jump Scare. I'm Eric Winnick.
And I'm Bradford Lorick.
21 Jump Scare is a podcast about horror films told from several points of view.
We call this podcast 21 Jump Scare because, at least for now, our plan is to produce only 21 episodes.
But also because, as in a certain TV series from the late 80s featuring one of the stars of today's film, one of us is going back to school, as it were, to learn something new. And that neophyte will be experiencing a horror film he hasn't seen yet.
So each week, we'll bring you a film from the perspective of someone rewatching it and from the point of view of somebody experiencing it for the first time.
So now let us turn to today's film, 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street.
So, Eric, as our first timer, why don't you start off by telling us just what A Nightmare on Elm Street is about?
Okay. Once upon a time, in a town that looks a lot like Venice, California, a group of teenagers are having nightmares in which they are being stalked by a mysterious psychotic in a ratty red and green sweater with a glove made of knives where his fingers should be. This creep turns out to be Fred Kreuger, a long-dead child molester, we believe, who was killed after a miscarriage of justice set him free, leaving a set of disgruntled parents to go after Kreuger themselves. Years later, the daughter of one set of parents, Nancy Thompson, having seen her friends be killed one by the dream monster Kreuger, decides to turn the tables on the killer and begins hatching a plan to bring him out of her dream and into the real world. Okay, so Bradford, tell us who is in this film.
Well, you have to start with Heather Langenkamp, who plays Nancy Thompson. This was really the biggest role of her career. She'd go on to reprise it in a couple more Nightmare on Elm Street franchise films, but the rest of her IMDb entry is mainly a series of small film and TV guest appearances, including as another famous Nancy Kerrigan.
Oh my God.
In Tanya and Nancy, the Inside Story.
Then there's Amanda Wyss as Tina. I like to think of Amanda Wyss as Beth from Better Off Dead. Her career is kind of like Heather's. She went on to a series of TV guest appearances and small films.
So what's going on here? An orgy or something?
Maybe a funeral, dickhead.
It's just a sleepover date, Rod. Tina and me.
Nick Corri plays Rod. He has one of those very fascinating Hollywood careers, which he began under his real name, Jesus Garcia.
Next is John Saxon as Lieutenant Thompson, Nancy's dad, best known for his role in because he was actually a black belt in real life. He played opposite Bruce Lee in Enter the Dragon.
Hey, everybody. Bradford here. As Eric astutely indicated at the top of the episode, there's some particularly crappy audio in here. And since this next bit is virtually unlistenable, I'm just going to tell you what I said. Here we go. And then we have my Facebook friend, Ronee Blakley, who plays Nancy's mother, Marge Thompson. Blakley may be best known up to this point for her role in Robert Altman's Nashville, for which she received an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actress, as well as her short-lived marriage to filmmaker Wim Wenders. And now here's Eric to tell you all about Robert Englund.
Let's talk about this guy. So this guy was on every television show, basically, between 1974 and 1984. It's like after 1984, he was just Freddy. That's it. Like, it was like, how could you see this guy as anything else? He did all the sequels. He played Freddy and a bunch of other things. It's hard to think of many actors who came to be more associated with one role.
And it's kind of interesting because, you know, I tend to feel like, you know, as children of the 80s who loved slasher movies, that you kind of had to pick a team. You know, you could be Team Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, or you could be Team Freddy Kreuger. And I was always Team Freddy. But the thing that is unique is that in the Friday the 13th series and in the Halloween series, different actors would play the roles of Jason or Michael Myers in subsequent installments. But Robert Englund consistently played Freddy Kreuger. And, you know, the unique physicality that he brought to it, the makeup that was designed in such a way to really sort of play up the features of his own face. It just sort of became the kind of thing where no one else could step into the role.
So, and then finally, as the credits say, introducing Johnny Depp as Glenn. And it's a real shame because we really couldn't find much on what Johnny Depp did after this film. He really kind of vanished into obscurity. Let me ask you a question. This Wes Craven guy, where was he at this point? I mean, what was going on with him?
Wes Craven, may he rest in peace. I mean, he ultimately became one of the biggest names in the horror genre. And he was ultimately the writer, director, producer of a handful of iconic franchises. But Craven's career, which really began in 1972 with the still, frankly, disturbing horror classic Last House on the Left, his career is full of gems like The Hills Have Eyes and The Serpent and the Rainbow and The People Under the Stairs, which is one of my favorites, which stars a woman near and dear to your heart, Wendy Roby, and also Scream, the Scream series. But it was this particular surreal slasher series that kind of cemented his place in the pantheon of genre greats who emerged around the same time, like John Carpenter and Tobe Hooper and Sam Raimi and George Romero, who was, I guess, a little bit earlier, but working contemporaneously with these guys. The list goes on, obviously. But it's A Nightmare on Elm Street, the original and the subsequent sequels, that really continue to receive the lion's share of attention.
Did he direct the sequels?
No, he has been involved in the sequels in a handful of capacities. He, I believe, wrote a subsequent sequel, and then, of course, he returned to the franchise with Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which I mentioned previously.
How did this film do at the box office?
It performed. It performed really well at the box office. Against its budget, its modest $1.8 million budget, it had a cumulative worldwide gross of $25.5 million. Its opening weekend gross, that would have been the 11th of November 1984 when it opened, it basically made back its budget. It made $1.2 million in its opening weekend. It was considered an instant commercial success. And its cumulative worldwide gross was $25.5 million.
So as for reviews, we did a little bit of research.
The contemporary reviews were kind of mixed, but the Washington Post said that for such a low-budget movie, Nightmare on Elm Street is extraordinarily polished. The script is consistently witty, the camera work is crisp and expressive. A Nightmare on Elm Street is halfway between an exploitation flick and classic surrealism.
So Variety called it highly imaginative, but said the film fails to tie up its thematic threads satisfyingly. At the conclusion, the reviewer really hated the scenes involving Nancy's family and said that the film's worst scenes involved Nancy and her alcoholic mother, Marge.
You want to know who Fred Kreuger was? He was a filthy child murderer who killed at least 20 kids in the neighborhood. Kids we all knew.
Oh, Mom.
It drove us crazy when we didn't know who it was. But it was even worse after they got him.
So how did you first hear about this film and where did you see it?
I was 6 years old. I believe I had an older cousin who was talking about this movie, A Nightmare on Elm Street. And I was sort of immediately intrigued. But it's also worth noting, I had few restrictions on what I could or couldn't watch when I was a little kid. And so, I saw the first television broadcast of Friday the 13th, the original Friday the 13th, when I was maybe 3 or 4. And I always had kind of an unusual interest in horror movies, and was sort of rarely scared by them.
Let me just stop you there for a second. You're saying you were 3 or 4 years old when you watched Friday the 13th on television. Who is your guardian at the time?
It was a summer night. We were having a camp out in the living room. I was with my mom and dad. And, that was in the days when network affiliates would have announcements that were made by, their voiceover guys before the broadcast of a movie of the week or a special screening. And I remember very clearly hearing the announcer preparing us for Friday the 13th and telling us to close our windows and lock our doors.
What station was showing Friday the 13th?
Probably ABC, CBS, or NBC, because in those days, that was before cable. And we had cable early, So I remember distinctly getting up off the sofa and going to check and make sure that the doors were locked. So that gives you any insight into how I kept my teeth on.
Let's just say that explains so much.
So the first time I actually saw A Nightmare on Elm Street, I obviously, or not so obviously, didn't see it in the theaters, but I saw it on video very shortly after it was released on VHS. And it kind of triggered a sort of immediate obsession. Like I said to you before, I was Team Freddy all the way. I saw every subsequent film in the theaters. So that meant that like my dad had to take me and a friend whose parents were also, probably somehow insane, to go and the scary movies, and my dad didn't really, he didn't really appreciate it. And sometime later, not much later, but I was probably 7 or 8 when my dad said, if you're going to watch these movies, you're going to watch good ones. And he rented Hitchcock's Psycho for me and my best friend, Eddie Farrell.
At what age again?
Probably 8. I was in 2nd grade.
2nd grade. And he showed you Psycho. That's interesting. So why this one?
This is, A Nightmare on Elm Street, the original Nightmare on Elm Street, is the alpha and the omega of 1980s slasher films. None of the other entries in the slasher canon kind of function in the same way as this movie does. It's probably got more in common with Buñuel's Un Chien Andalou than it has in common with, the films where campers are slaughtered, or, and there are a million of those, not just Friday the 13th. That's only the most well-known. But, everything about this film, from the inspiration through the execution, is kind of unique. I would say that it's probably true that the other films in the franchise don't live up to the standard that the original sets. I think it's probably true of many franchises, right? But and there are unique sequels. Yeah, I think that if you're going to take the plunge and really experience horror films, this one has to be among, the most important lessons you can receive. And I just got to know, did you like it?
Oh, man. What a question. I admired it. I appreciated what it set out to accomplish. I think for a film made for $1.8 million, it looks great. The effects are impressive. The way they achieve some of the practical effects, mind-blowing. Was I fully captivated by the story or the characters? I'm going to say no. I can admire a film for what it's doing while sort of being distracted by some of the things that don't work about it. And I think that for some reason, and probably having to do with my age, and I tend to notice the things that don't work just as much as I notice the things that do. I'm curious to ask you whether you found this film scary.
Objectively, this film is scary. Subjectively, as a fucked up little kid who loved scary shit, I was not particularly terrified by it. I wasn't scared of Freddy Kreuger. I kind of wanted to be Freddy Kreuger,
Of course.
And in fact, my dad made me a copy of Freddy's glove. That was pretty authentic. I mean, it was all made out of, copper and what have you. But yeah, so I wasn't scared by it or of it. I was kind of exhilarated by it.
Did you ever go out for Halloween as Freddy Kreuger?
In fourth grade, it was not my greatest Halloween costume. I used to have, my parents would really get crazy around Halloween and make pretty lavish, well-designed Halloween costumes. But the year that I went as Freddy Kreuger, I bought the commercially available rubber mask, a red and green sweater. It was not the most adventurous or well-executed Halloween costume, but
are you apologizing for buying a store-bought costume, Bradford?
I am. It was so unusual.
This might be an appropriate time to talk about the experience of seeing this film for the first time at age 40 plus something. I'm just going to answer the question about, was this film scary? It is very, very hard to judge this film based on, is it scary? For some reason now, I don't scare very easily. I get moved and I get disturbed, but I don't get scared very easily. When I was watching this film, I tried to astrally project myself back to high school in 1984, and I was certainly not seeing horror movies because I wasn't into them back then. So seeing it for the first time, I definitely didn't find it scary, but I found myself wondering, would 16-year-old me have found it scary? Maybe.
Before we start, we do want to issue a full spoiler alert. We will be spoiling this film completely and utterly. If you have not seen this film and plan to, please watch the film, then come back and listen to the episode.
Glenn?
There are some incredible set pieces here. Images that, while I don't find them scary, I will not soon forget.
There are moments in this film that truly are iconic. We're presented with these, surreal, nightmarish, dream logic scenarios and images. So go on, dive in.
This film obviously is about dreams and how dreams and reality can blend. And I think one of the most clever things about it is it doesn't really give you a lot of signposts for when someone is dreaming, other than they might close their eyes for a minute. There's no real signifiers that somebody has entered the nightmare, other than that, they might venture out onto the street in their pajamas and bare feet. For all intents and purposes, things are kind of normal, which is one of the things that makes it really strange when the perspective switches. Tina, who is having sex with her bad boyfriend Rod, falls asleep and has a nightmare that she runs into Freddie. And the scene that ensues is really more from Rod's perspective than from Tina's, although we see what's happening to her in her dream. Actually, what is happening to her in real life is actually quite a bit scarier. She is apparently being slashed repeatedly, but her body is being thrown to the wall and then on the ceiling of the room. And this is one of the real indelible images from the film. Is just her screaming in pain and horror and bleeding as she's literally rolling around on the walls and the ceiling of this room. And Rod, in his tighty whities, is tossed aside and has to watch this until Tina comes crashing down on the bed in a big splash of blood, which apparently was edited to avoid a one of the reasons this film was edited to avoid an X rating. But that scene in itself, I have to say, I cannot say enough about it. I just thought that was so well executed.
In that scene, there's a moment where Freddie's iconic finger knives, his glove, slashes at Tina's chest. You're watching you're watching Tina being torn apart.
Yes.
By invisible knives. To your point, the cumulative effect of this sequence is kind of, it really sort of drops you immediately into the world of this film.
Yes.
The fact that it was 1984 and that these special effects were all practical effects.
Yeah, that's the thing that's amazing.
In camera is one of the things that when I return to this film, which I do fairly frequently, I continue to be, as I was then when I saw it, really impressed by the quality and the imagination and the sort of resulting emotional response to a lot of the special effects in the film.
I think now is the time to probably admit that I've watched a little bit of a making of documentary and learned subsequently that they did in fact rotate this room.
They custom built this gimbal, rotate the room, which they use effectively. I'm sure we will get into it very soon. They use it at a couple of points in this film.
So moving on to the other scene that has a really just an indelible image is the death of the character Glenn, the boyfriend of Nancy Thompson, our plucky heroine. Glenn has this habit of falling asleep always at the wrong moment, and especially in this scene, because at this point Tina's dead, Rod is dead. How did this scene feel to you?
Well, it probably opens with one of the kind of lighter moments in the film. Glenn is having a conversation with his mother. He goes to bed. He's in the most 80s way possible. He's watching, I think, Nude Miss America on a tiny portable television that sits on his chest. He's listening to music on his headphones. And I believe in this scene, and please correct me if I'm wrong, he's wearing a crop top, a half shirt, a midriff-bearing tee. And as he's in bed, he is pulled, sort of in half through an opening in the bed. You know, he's just sucked into the center of his mattress, which pulls in the television, the stereo, and you know, a couple of other things around. And then suddenly, a lot more comes out of the bed than goes in.
It's entirely possible. And also the spinning room comes into effect here because I believe the reason that the blood is cascading with such volume upwards from the bed is because the scene was actually shot with the room upside down and they were pouring the blood into the bed from up top. So it was actually gravity, I believe, which made the blood come through so quickly. Am I wrong about that?
Fascinatingly, because of the limited resources on the film, they were only able to shoot that scene one time. They had to get it in one take. And there are some pretty amazing stories that both Wes Craven and others involved in the production of the film talk about. There was no way to test it, so when they let loose with these hundreds of gallons of blood, it really imbalanced the gimbal. Right, started to spin crazily. The liquid interacted badly with the enormous amount of electric lights that were on set. A member of the production team was electrocuted in the blood. It could have been a really bad situation and more of a mess than it actually was. Amazingly, they captured it in one take, and it has become one of the most memorable scenes in the entire film.
Yeah. If you had to pick out two scenes from the film, I mean, the death of Tina and the death of Glenn are the real standouts for me in this film. Now, to criticize this film, it's almost, inconsequential at this point, given how this film has sort of ascended to classic status. It's sort of impossible to view this film through a modern lens, but, there are some question marks here. So when it's revealed that that Fred was in fact this notorious child murderer, Nancy finds out from her mother, Marge.
Very unusual way.
Yes. Well, essentially, Marge sits Nancy down in their basement in front of their boiler and tells her the story about how the parents formed the posse after this miscarriage of justice and sort of took matters into their own hands. But the most interesting thing for me about this scene is the fact that she then reaches into the boiler and pulls out Freddie's knife glove, which is conveniently stored away. Why would Marge have kept this thing as a memento? And then the question becomes does he come to life to get them and then vanish back into dreams? Like, what is the point of keeping these knives? I don't understand.
Well, I think it's a pretty cool souvenir, don't you?
Well, of course, it's cool, but at the same time, it's sort of like, if this guy exists primarily in dreams, what are his knives doing in the Thompson's boiler?
I think that I would caution you against trying to apply too much logic for two reasons. One of which is that it operates in a sort of dream logic way. And secondly, it's a slasher movie made in 1984. So I don't know that every aspect of the script or the finished film will really hold up to intense critical scrutiny.
Are you basically saying that I am overthinking it?
For a film that is aimed at a largely teenage movie-going audience and is, trying to get them to first toss their popcorn and then, go make out someplace. I don't know that that these kinds of films necessarily want for a super sort of intellectual excavation. That said, Nightmare on Elm Street is far and away kind of a better film than most of its contemporaries. It does have a bit more thought, I think, a bit more sort of intelligence that came from Craven than a lot of the other sort of contemporary entries into the canon. I think that, I guess to conclude that, it's like this combination of dream logic and the audience for whom it's made kind of mean that for this, you can't necessarily apply a strict sort of logical unpacking of what you're seeing.
You know, I mean, I've seen incredibly well executed dream logic in films. I mean, Mulholland Drive, the entire film is dream logic and it plays like one long dream. I don't think this film quite lives up to that standard in terms of dream logic. In fact, I have some issues with the film that I think there could be more dream logic to it. Like, let's just go to the scene in the sleep clinic where Nancy is, you know, they're measuring her sleep patterns, and when she has a nightmare, she wakes up and she suddenly has Freddy's hat. Her doctor, played by Charles Fleischer, they're baffled by this. It's kind of neat, the idea of a dream externalizing. At one point, she has a burn on her arm. But at the same time, it's like, where did the hat come from?
What do you mean, where did the hat come from?
Is the idea that she is slowly sort of drawing him out of the dream. And so, therefore, the beginning of that is like she gets the hat, and then eventually she gets him. She like draws him out.
Well, she learns that she can manipulate what's happening in her dreams.
Right.
And the alternative is being killed. You know, I think as we kind of talk about the things that we like about this film, you know, something that always kind of really excited me about it was sort of the third act, when Nancy becomes probably the best example of a final girl in a horror film, because she makes herself, she creates herself not as a victim but as a victor in her battle against Freddy Kreuger. As she and Glenn are, you know, walking around on the bridges in Venice, you know, and they're talking about her copy of Booby Traps and Improvised Anti-Personnel Devices, you know, like a really perverse kind of Home Alone, you know, where, you know, she's filling up light bulbs with gunpowder, and she's, you know, rigging sledgehammers on piano wire above doors so that when Freddy Kreuger comes through the door, you know, he's going to get destroyed. And it's only through her convincing herself that she can have an effect on the dream in which she finds herself, that she can triumph over Freddy Kreuger. And the way to do that is to deprive him of the dream world in which he lives, where he is sort of all powerful, and to bring him into the real world where he's subject to the laws of you know, physics, you know, so that she can fight him on a more equal footing, on a more equal ground. And I always found that entire sort of sequence to be one of my favorites in the entire film, including, you know, the shots of Heather Langenkamp running up the stairs, falling into, you know, pits of Captain Crunch and shag carpet, you know, that are like quicksand pulling her in as she's running through the house.
Nancy, help me, please. Save me from
Freddy.
This is just a dream. This isn't real. This is just a dream. He isn't real.
Okay, so you know, Nancy, fresh off of you know, having tried out everything that she learned in Booby Traps and Improvised Anti-Personnel Devices, you know, running Fred Kreuger through the house on Elm Street, much like Macaulay Culkin runs Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern through their gorgeous Chicago home, you know.
Clearly an influence.
I mean, absolutely. I would say so. You know, the next morning, after Nancy has ignored Freddy and sent him away, everything's quote unquote back to normal. she walks out of the house as if nothing has happened, to go to school. Her mother is still alive.
Looking fresh as a daisy.
Looking fresh as a daisy and no longer an alcoholic because she just doesn't need it anymore. So Nancy, with a spring in her step, and her mother are standing on the front porch as Glenn and Rod and Tina pull up in a convertible. And, Nancy gets into the car, which would you like to talk about? What
I mean, she gets into the car and the top comes flying down and whacks some of them in the head. I did not notice this at the time, but upon realizing it was actually the red and green stripes of Freddy's colors, let's just say. Nancy looks back at her mother, is like, "Bye, Mom," and seems to be seeing something through the window, which is perplexing. We don't see it at first.
As Marge watches a trio of little neighborhood girls playing jump rope and singing
right
the sort of sing-song Freddy Kreuger nursery rhyme, 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you, and on and on.
Yeah, and then she's standing there on the porch, and suddenly Freddy's arm comes through the window. And I don't even know how to describe it. I mean, he literally pulls her entire body through a window in the door in a way that is just indescribable. I mean, it's not like there's any suffering. It's not like it's painful. It's her body just goes thwip through the window, and then and that's it. I mean, that's the film's over.
It is sort of the equivalent of probably breaking a window on an airplane in flight.
Correct. She gets sucked into the house.
You happen to also be made out of inflatable sex doll material.
Well, I mean, okay, right. We find that yes, that's how the scene was made. But as an end scene, it felt to me like it was clearly setting up a sequel.
Not only does it set up a sequel, but doesn't it also call into question a handful of things that we understood about the film to begin with?
Yes. I mean, the whole scene felt to me very unreal. In fact, I should say that when she first steps out on that porch, I forgot about this, there are wisps of mist that are just off camera. And it struck me that it's very strange that they're on this beautiful, bright, sunny day. And it struck me that it was a little bit of a clue. Maybe they threw that in there because they felt like we needed something to clue us in that maybe this is not reality.
And if it's not reality, where do you think it is?
Also, who's dreaming? Is it Marge's dream? It could be any number of things. I actually appreciated that. I have to say I did appreciate that last scene. I didn't quite understand what was going on, but I have to say, I'm glad they didn't tie this film up with a neat bow. It seemed appropriate to end on this note of dubious finality.
That's a sort of great way to phrase it. But, you can sort of interpret it in kind of one of two ways, right? Like either in a kind of Groundhog Day kind of way, she has, caused a kind of ripple in Freddy Kreuger's dream world that has returned her friends to reality, to life. But we've gone through this film attending the funerals of the kids who've died. Has she somehow managed to, Back to the Future herself through her manipulation of her dreams?
I don't know. I guess we have to see the sequel to find out. I have to mention a couple other things that just tickled me about this film, which you, of course, I'm sure you loved as well. As a sign of how old this film is, I had forgotten that when you take a landline off the hook and put it on the table, nobody can call you because, in fact, you're going to just get a busy signal. And this happens in Glenn's house when his parents take the phone off the hook because they don't want Nancy calling anymore. The other thing I loved was Nancy deliberately trying to keep herself awake. And I believe her mother removes a coffee maker from her room, only for Nancy to then reach under her bed and pull out another coffee maker, which is another just wonderful moment.
I mean, around the same time, we discover that Nancy also has a gray streak in her hair.
Yes, that's true. She does.
Right. And she says, God, I must look 20 years old.
Yeah, because she's 15. I love, yeah, that's a great line too.
But yeah, so what other sort of things kind of charmed you, or did you kind of dig on that you weren't expecting?
I think I was not expecting the opening credits to be in a letterbox format with this really like very cheap looking font, you know, announcing the film. The opening credits are very strange in that it's Freddie creating his instrument of death essentially in this little letterbox, which then eventually expands to the whole screen. But the thing is that it's just a really weird way to start a movie. And it made me think, like, is the whole film going to be in this format? Like, what's going on here?
You know, I mean, talk about adjusting the tracking, you know. I sort of shuttle wheeled my way through that scene a frame at a time, watching him build his glove when I was a little kid. You know, I always sort of loved the physical act of you know, creating that extension of his arm. You know, I thought it was kind of fantastic.
And the winner is, well, the time has come.
Now it's time for the awards segment of our show, in which we give out prizes for the scenes and characters that we think made this such a memorable film. So, Eric, let's talk about the most disturbing scene.
Let's give out that Tom Six Award. I don't think anything in this film truly disturbed me, which may say something more about me. But again, if I had to pick, it would be the geyser of blood, just because there's so much of it. How about you?
I have to say that I think I'm going to be returning to a particular moment twice here during award season tonight, because I think for me the most disturbing scene is probably the opening scene, like the real opening scene, where the scene where Tina is killed. You know, it's so brutal and so strange and comes so early in the film that while it does certainly serve to immediately locate you as an audience member into the not only the story, but also the way the story is going to be told, I do find it really disturbing. I mean, just watching Miss Wyss be completely brutalized and tossed around, defying gravity in that bedroom, I think it's really upsetting.
Yeah, I definitely, I'm with you on that. And I think, you know, that would have been my other choice. And I thought about that. It's almost like you expect to see a brutal killing in a film like this, albeit done ingeniously in this film. But I just did not expect volume of blood and gore that poured out of that bed. And it just, that got me somehow more than the death of Tina. I don't know why.
It's such an enormous gesture. All that blood. It doesn't. There's no way that Glenn's body contained all of that blood. Do you know? So for me, it always kind of felt a little bit operatic or kind of Byzantine in its scale, and therefore it didn't quite disturb me in the same way. Like it didn't have the same kind of real brutality to it. But I totally appreciate it.
Let's move on to our next award, which would be our most likable character, the Seth Brundle Award, named, of course, for Jeff Goldblum, his character in The Fly, the David Cronenberg film. Who did you have for this one, Bradford?
Nancy. I like Nancy a lot. I think she's she's pretty smart and with it and capable, and it's she who saves herself and maybe her friends, according to that strange ending. But I think she's a real likable girl.
I am 100% with you on this. She is a plucky heroine. She paved the way for many others, I'm sure. Without a doubt, most likable character is Nancy in this film. On that note, who was the character that most deserved to live? The so-called Ellen Ripley Award, named for Sigourney Weaver's character in the Alien franchise. Who deserved to live, but in fact does not?
I think, and this kind of goes hand in hand with my most likable character, literally, but I would have liked to see Glenn live. I mean, again, it's kind of amorphous at that ending scene, whether or not her friends are still alive. But I guess maybe for this movie, I'll call it the character who least deserved to die. And I think it's Glenn.
I was gonna say Glenn, because really his worst offense is falling asleep at the wrong time, and who hasn't done that? But I'm gonna go with Tina, poor Tina, who really did nothing more than just be a cute blonde teenager who fucked the bad boy. Did she really deserve what she got, considering what she got? Honestly, I don't think so. I liked Tina. I wish we had gotten to know more about Tina. I just found Glenn to be such a wet blanket. I could not go in that direction. Sorry.
You make an interesting point, which is that Tina had sex, and in the rules.
That's true. I did not think about that, but you're right. That is a one of those rules, right?
Usually the requirement of the survivor is virginity.
Okay, so next would be the character that most deserved to die, the John Doe Award, named for Kevin Spacey in Seven. Who do you have for that?
The hall monitor. Fucking hated that idiot. It really brings the movie down for me. Oh. And what about you? Who most deserved to die?
Oh, Rod. I mean, without a doubt. I mean, it's just, he's a pig. He treats Tina like shit, although arguably she is consenting, and they do have what sounds to be pretty wild sex. I just have to say that he's just awful character. And though, yes, it's true, he wasn't responsible for Tina dying. I just didn't like him. I just thought he was awful. And I was actually quite glad when he perished.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so then we're gonna go to perhaps my favorite award, the most gratuitous screen moment, the Gaspar Noé / Ken Russell Award. I'll start this one out, Bradford. I'm just gonna say it right here. I have a tie on this one, and it's somewhere between. It's either Freddie ripping his chest open and the green slime and maggots oozing out, or the tongue coming out of the phone for the "I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy" moment.
Gosh, I would have to say Wes Craven, would that he were still alive, might agree with me here. I find the most gratuitous screen moment, that silly sequence at the end of the film when the top of the convertible starts to extend and it's painted with red and green stripes. And I feel like it's like totally over the top and unnecessary.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you do, please give us a rating on iTunes. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your loved ones, tell the ones that you don't even know to subscribe. And be sure to check out additional information on our website, 21jumpscare.com. Our theme music is by Sir Cubworth.
Thanks for joining us, folks. We'll see you next time at the internet's latest address for horror, 21 Jump Scare.